Well, thank you everyone for being here. We have quite the full house, so thanks for making yourself comfortable. My name is Fayad Ali. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Government here. Most of my work focuses on democracy and identity in the Indian context. And this seminar is the Brown-Harvard Joint Seminar on South Asia, which is co-run this year by me and Ashu Varshni from Brown. This is our final event of the semester, and we actually started the semester with a pretty packed event about the uprisings in Bangladesh. So it's only fitting that we conclude by thinking sort of more historically with a paper from Mushfiq. So by way of introduction, Mushfiq Mobarak is the Jerome Kassoff 54 professor of management and economics at Yale University, with concurrent appointments in the School of Management and in the Department of Economics. He is the founder and faculty director of the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale. And he has, several ongoing projects, as you probably all know, focused on contexts including Bangladesh, Sierra Leone, Nepal, etc. Some of his work uses field experiments to explore ways to induce people in developing countries to adopt technologies or behaviors that are likely to be welfare improving. And he's done a series of excellent work with governments related to COVID-19 response a few years back. Today, he'll be presenting some work that's more historical in focus, and it's about the Bangladesh independence movement, which we'll hear more about in a second. So you'll have about 35 to 40 minutes. We don't typically in the seminar do econ style interruption. So typically, if you have a question that's clarifying, you can ask it, but we mean clarifying. But save your urgent questions until the end, because we do have a 2 to 4 time period. So we do have quite a bit of time for discussion.
Don't forget the wine and samosas.
Yes, we also have wine and samosas afterwards. So there's even more discussion after 4 p.m. So after Mushfiq's presentation, we'll actually have Martha Chen give some comments. She's a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and an affiliated professor at the Graduate School of Design. She's a development practitioner and scholar with focus on employment, gender, poverty, specifically focusing on the working poor in the informal economy. Before joining Harvard, she had 2 decades of experience in Bangladesh, working with BRAC, and she'll provide us with comments related to the paper, given her firsthand experience there during the cyclone that will be discussed, some context on the national election and the Pakistan crackdown that followed. And then after that, which will be about 10 minutes, I'll give a short set of more social science-focused discussion comments on the presentation, and then we'll open up to a broader Q&A. So looking forward, and thank you all for being here. Mushfiq, it's all you.
Okay, thank you. Good. I will stand here so nobody's staring at my back. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you also for putting in effort to read the slides. I have to first apologize to the 2 discussants, Marty and that this is entirely new. I mean, it's so new that I had to send slides at 1:55 to someone. he can verify how new this is. So we have Sultan and I have a research assistant in Moscow who was like sending team slides. But hopefully he sent it about 5-10 minutes ago. And so the other thing, the reason for the last minute, this is not out of disrespect. I'm teaching 6 classes at the moment. So luckily I don't teach on Fridays. And so thank you, Asha, for inviting me and making room for this. Okay, and also this is, I've already had some meetings today and across departments. This is a really good university. There's a lot of good people. In case you didn't know. Okay, and the paper is co-authored. This is actually meaningful in this case. Sultan Mahmood, he's Pakistani. And so we're going to be talking about, and he lives in Russia. So we're going to be talking about.
And you might add your Bangladesh.
Yeah, exactly.
And
so
Bangladeshi,
Pakistani paper written in New Haven and Moscow. All right, so and the final thing I'll say is that I'm really looking forward to the comments from everybody. I don't normally do history or political science, or as you call it here, government. I'm an economist, and so I have a lot to learn. Is it working now?
Let's see. May I? Oh, always technical
Okay.
trouble. That's good. So we have backup batteries for fellas.
Okay.
Okay.
It's fine. I'll just go back up a little bit. Working now?
There we go.
Okay, great. So I'm going to give you two pieces of motivation for writing this. And since we have 30-40 minutes, what I'll do is give you a pretty comprehensive introduction to the paper. I'll get through that in 30-40 minutes, right? In terms of details of like all of the robustness checks, etc. We probably won't have time to go through all of that. Let's see. But we'll have slides, and in case those questions come up, we'll go through them. Okay. So there's two pieces of motivation. So one is that there are lots of revolutionary attempts around the world in many different countries. And here's a map that shows the geographic dispersion from a Nature paper that was recently published to sort of just track separatist movements around the world, right? So over 400 attempts. Only 125 succeeded in achieving their primary objectives, and only 34 of these revolutions led to the creation of new nation states, right? So these things don't always succeed, right? And one reason for us to explore this particular episode, which is the creation of Bangladesh from pre-1971 Pakistan, is to understand, under what are the conditions that need to come together for one of these movements to succeed and create a new nation state. Okay? And so basically, hopefully we'll study one particular episode in depth, right, with a lot of large sample data, and maybe it can teach us something about the conditions for success, right? What are the preconditions for success that are more conducive to success? And in this particular case, we'll talk about the role. There was many, of course. There's never a single cause for an event such as an independence of a new country and creates the 8th most populous country in the world, right? But we will focus on something we can identify in the data, which is a climate shock. And in particular, to date still, maybe the deadliest weather event in all of human history was the 1970 Bhola Cyclone, right? That doesn't mean it was a particularly large cyclone. It was actually only a category 4. Right? And I spend a lot of time in the Caribbean where my wife is from, and we've had category 5 storms coming right over our island. That doesn't lead to many deaths at all. So there was other things at play, and politics will play a role there as well, right? As to why is it that a category 4 cyclone led to an estimated somewhere between 300,000 to 500,000 deaths. The fact that so many deaths occurred, clearly it says something about politics, it says something about leadership and responses, right? And people learn from that, right? And that's the story that we're going to tell today, because it became very obvious to people who lived through it at the time that who their government was and what their interests were. Okay? And so we're going to take this is a topic, and the particular thesis I'm advancing, that's not new. Right? There have been books and other social scientists that are using more qualitative approaches have made this point that this cyclone played a role. So the new thing that we will bring to the table is to digitize a lot of data that we were really fortunate to find, because in one case, the primary source of data was a satellite that was only operational for a few months, right? And it went offline 4 days after the cyclone. Yeah. And so we were just lucky to catch pictures of the cyclone at the right time. And that allows us to say something statistically, right, using large sample data on what type of role the cyclone may have played and quantify something about how much of a role it played. Okay. And the second motivation I want to give you is this emerging literature, like looking forward, right? What can history teach us about the future? So there's an emerging literature with a lot of really excellent large sample work that's nicely summarized in a paper published in Science by Sol Sian, Marshall Burke, and Ted Miguel, who are at Berkeley and Stanford School of Sustainability. And they did something along the lines of a meta-analysis, right? Summarizing 60 different studies, and they find really robust patterns where climate aberrations, right, in the form of too much or too little rainfall, right, like abnormal rainfall and abnormal temperatures, right? There is a very strong pattern throughout history that whenever you have climate shocks, that increases conflict. Okay? And this shows up in many, many different types of data sets, right? Sometimes sort of country studies, sometimes cross-country work. And the reason we can look across history is that, of course, data on temperature, data on rainfall, right? There's lots of clues left, so you can go back hundreds of years. There's clues left in various forms of data that scientists across many different disciplines can pick up. Okay, so now, so that's been so the reason why that literature has become really popular recently is because we need to understand.
In large deviations, not small deviations.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
has to be
These are
very large
shocks.
Yeah.
So
Large
it turns out-
deviations from the anomaly.
Yeah, but I mean, like you can see the x-axis there, right?
Yeah.
So the deviation we're talking about, so on the y-axis is conflict risk.
Yeah.
Say on the, deviations we were talking about are like between -2 degrees to +2 degrees. Right. So deviations that are not too dissimilar to our expectations of what's about to happen with climate change. Yeah. And okay, so now, so there is, I mean, again, that, there's a large amounts of data that people have been tracking this, right? Now, and the reason we've become interested is that climate change is coming and these types of deviations are what we expect to see, right? So we might worry about like one of the effects of climate change might be elevated conflict, right? And sometimes you can probably, maybe intuit why that might happen, right? If there are droughts, that might lead to more competition for resources that could create conditions for conflict, right? But the thing is that from these, as impressive as all this work is, it's not possible for us to understand the mechanism by which temperature or rainfall deviation or a drought or a cyclone, right, leads to elevated conflict, right? So what we're going to do in this paper is do the statistical work to illuminate the detailed mechanism for this one really important episode, right? And the reason why I think that's also going to be related to climate change is that one of the, I also work on, actually, mostly I don't do this. Mostly I'm working on now climate change adaptation in coastal Bangladesh. Yeah? And one of the, and I work with a number of scientists at MIT, mostly meteorologists and climate scientists. And one of the model's main predictions that come from the climate science is that climate change is expected to change both the frequency as well as the severity of natural disasters, things like cyclone events. Okay? And that has to do with for example, we're seeing, and this is something we're already seeing in the Caribbean, right? This year, we had the first storm that hit our house was in June. That had never happened. I mean, it was the second earliest in history, right? And so in this case, when looking back in history, we have this one episode of this 1970 Bhola Cyclone, right? And what that did was not only was it a big disaster event, it also revealed something about the politicians, like the type of politicians, right? And their callous response towards Bengalis. And that created a focal point for anger, which, within months led to a war for independence. Okay? And we'll, statistically try to build that story for you today in the next episode. Okay. I'm going in the wrong direction, I think. Yeah. Okay. So just to give you context, for this room, it's probably not that necessary. But this was a weird country. Right? Countries normally don't look like this. So where you have two provinces that are separated by 1,000 miles of another country that's not particularly friendly. Okay. And so like when you look at this map, it turns out like something I can tell you me from Bangladesh, my co-author from Pakistan, is that really there isn't much that is in common between the two countries other than religion. Okay? I mean, of course, like relative to Canadians, yes, we have probably more in common, right? We probably all enjoy Hindi films more than Canadians do, although I don't know. But in terms of like language, which was sort of the start of our independence movement, right? In terms of culture, in terms of the way that Islam is practiced, right? And was not, I mean, it's very, very dissimilar, right? This is not if we had to be in a country, in a joint country with another group of people, like that's not that wouldn't be the most natural pairing, Yeah.
West Bengal would be.
West Bengal would be a much more natural pairing, yes. Yeah, and in fact, yeah, if that border didn't exist, that probably would have saved lots of lives. Right? So but anyway, it happened, right? The other thing that is probably, I'll mention it. This is not something I will have data on. It's just, this is just more like lived experiences and stories from my parents. My parents met in Lahore. They were studying, this is pre-partition, pre-independence, I shouldn't say partition, pre-1971. And so they have a lot of exposure, right? My father was studying in government college in Lahore. My mother was studying in Fatima Jinnah Medical College. And there is, and something I've experienced much later, right? There's also a lot of, I was trying to find a polite word, but let's say racism, and that was quite, that was, of course, much more obvious and present and salient pre-1971, right? And that can maybe explain some of the results that we see. That's what I'm mentioning. Okay, so here's a quick history of our independence movement, right? One really important event was on 21st February, 1952, which is
President Ayub's two books refer to Bengalis in racial terms. It's not simply what you experience.
Yeah.
The person who led Pakistan for 10 odd years describes Bengali Muslims in extremely racial terms in both of it.
Yeah, yeah. It is true. I mean, just to maybe explain where it might come from, it is true that there is a skin color difference, right? There is a height difference, right? And so there's sort of like, there's obvious markers that maybe allow, like obvious salient markers that allows people to discriminate. Yeah. All right, so 21st February, which is the UN now recognizes as International Mother Language Day, right? That was an important event in that Muhammad Ali Jinnah wanted to impose Urdu as the national language of all of Pakistan, right? But the language was important to us, and a few, and students, Dhaka University students were protesting in the street and police fired, right? And a few students died. But just to put that in perspective, and we've never forgotten it, right? We have memorials to the students who died, and that was an important focal point that started sort of the separatist movement. I shouldn't say started, but it was a really important moment for elevating those sentiments. Okay, but just to put that in perspective, in terms of maybe later on after the talk, we can talk about what's going on in Bangladesh this summer, okay? As opposed to those handful of students that died in 1952, this summer, maybe 600 to 800 students were killed by the departing Awami League. And Awami League is going to play a role in this paper, of course. Okay. And then the other like basic facts I want to share from that period between 1950 and 1970, when like the separatist movement really took hold, is that while East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, constituted the majority of the population, was 2/3, right? So much smaller. We used to be a lot more densely populated. And of course, fertility rates in Bangladesh have been much lower than in Pakistan, so that's now reversed. But at that time, 2/3 of the population, but received only 29% of government budget. And this is data from the Planning Commission of Pakistan. Okay? Well, over that entire period, like it varied. Sometimes it was 23%, sometimes 30%, but it varied. But it was, and so there was a unequal distribution of resources. And what made that particularly jarring is that a lot of the revenues were being generated from jute exports, and Bengal and East Pakistan in particular, at one point accounted for about 80% of all jute production in the world. Okay? And the reason why jute exports was important is that you remember this is a period of a lot of wars happening around the world, right? And like sandbags, jute bags, etc. That's what led to elevated demand for jute. Okay? And so these types of both political and economic inequalities were extremely obvious to people. Political inequality also because the center of power was always in West Pakistan. Okay? And so a group of scholars, economists, Nurul Islam, Rehman Soban. Rehman Soban is still alive. He's here in DC. Nurul Islam recently passed away. He spent actually a year at Yale in 1970 in the Economic Growth Center. So they wrote up, in partnership with political leaders like the Awami League, right? So they drafted what was called the Choi Daffa Andolan, six-point movement. Okay. So what they what they were demanding was decentralization, right? Both administrative as well as budgetary, and decoupling. Okay, decoupling in the following sense that we should have local tax collection authority in East Pakistan, right? And there should be separate currencies, two different currencies, right? And that, why two different currencies? Because that would act as a friction for recycling revenues that were being earned in East Pakistan and being invested in West Pakistan for West Pakistan development, right? And also, a part of one of the points of the movement was to have a separate military or paramilitary force, right? Because what happened in March 1971 is suddenly we are in the middle of a civil war where only one province has a military and the other one has no military power whatsoever. Okay? All right, so that's the quick history of that period, right? So the six-point movement was in 1966. The Awami League was increasingly popular around that time, right? They were competing for like this 1970 election. So Pakistan didn't have a very good history of like regular elections at that time. Okay. There was a lot of martial law, military taking of power, etc. Okay, and then I want to just focus on that little timeline because there's going to be specific events that will correspond to our data. Okay, so the elections were December of 1970. Okay, and it just so happened, obviously, an act of nature was less than a month before the election, 12th November 1970 is when the Bhola Cyclone hits. Okay. And so, I'm pointing this out because I'm going to show you some data on what happened in those elections, right, as a function of variation in storm intensity, right? So the data that I'm going to be correlating is really literally 3 to 4 weeks apart. Okay. And then, so December 1970, elections are held, Awami League wins. I'll also show you some data on how big a role did the Bhola Cyclone have in shifting popularity towards the Awami League, right? And then the Pakistan government in West Pakistan decides not to relinquish power to the Awami League, who had just won the election. So basically, a simple way to think about it is that 65% of the population is in East Pakistan. So therefore, the majority of seats are there, and the Awami League basically wins everything in East Pakistan. Okay. And so they have the majority of seats. So now they should be the ones forming government, right? And in the name of negotiations between December and March, right? What ultimately happened was the Awami League, the head of Awami League, the person who's now called Father of the Nation for Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. So he is jailed, and Marty, I'm not going to say too much about this because Marty was living in Dhaka or Dhaka at the time, and maybe she can tell us a lot more about what the situation was like. Yeah. I wasn't born, so that's another reason. Yeah.
The 6-point program asked for separate militaries or separate paramilitaries?
Paramilitary. I mean, it's hard to, I mean, so not that they would be a completely independent military, but a force that was labeled these paramilitary. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'll update that. Okay. So now, 26 March 1971, basically a civil war commences with the military basically opening fire. Okay. And
I'll just make a two-hander on that.
Yeah.
The 25th, 26th was actually the military crackdown and Operation Searchlight. And the mobilization of Mukti Bahini and the actual starting of the war was a bit later.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
So
that makes sense.
Collapse them because the crackdown was really important in terms of one of your variables.
Okay.
If I may.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. And okay. So then with the military crackdown, right? So now slowly, Marty just referred to the Mukti Bahini. So essentially, there's freedom fighters, so people who have basically to engage in sort of guerrilla like warfare. Okay, and so we're also going to digitized data on the identities on the freedom fighters, people who engaged, to try and understand their birthplaces and whether it has anything to do with where the storm hit. Okay. Now, the other source of data that we have to try and understand whether those areas that were badly hit by the storm, did they have sort of elevated political activity and did they become a focal point, is that on 14th December 1971, which was just 2 days before the Pakistani army surrendered. So India basically...
India intervened when?
December 5 of 1971. I mean,
within 2 weeks, the war was over.
Yeah, the war was over very
By the
2 weeks.
16th.
Yeah, by the 16th is Victory Day.
Yeah.
So going back to Marty's earlier comment, so 26th March is what we celebrate as our Independence Day. So as soon as the military crackdown started, we declared independence. Okay. So that's why that date is important. Okay. And then 16th December is what we call Victory Day. So that was the date that the Pakistani military surrenders in written form in front of the Indian military. Right? And in terms of that's so 5th December would be the military intervention. Of course, India was taking lots of refugees prior to that. So there was a lot of, like, India was relevant even prior to that. Yeah. But here's the amazing thing. So you see there's actually 2 lines right by 16th. It's very, very close together. And it's quite striking what happened. So 14th of December. So essentially, by this point, it's become clear that Pakistan has to surrender, right? But 14th December, they rounded up intellectuals, doctors, professors, right, teachers, right? Made a list, rounded them up, and murdered them. And the idea is,
Somebody in your family.
maybe to handicap.
Yeah. Okay.
New nation.
Mhm.
Okay. So, so why that data is going to be useful for us is that obviously they weren't, it wasn't like the Pakistan government was thinking about where the cyclone hit and then going after, but it turns out that the birthplaces of those martyred intellectuals, right, just like the birthplace of the freedom fighters, those cyclone-affected districts are overrepresented. That's what we show in the data. Okay. Not because they were targeted, it's just that, the story is that certain types of places that showed elevated political activity, right, became focal points. And then that shows up in the decisions that are made for the next, for the things. Okay. All right. So now let me get into what we're doing. So what time do I
We have until around 50 to 55.
55 minutes. Okay. So, all right. So now let me tell you a little bit about the data, right? So this was actually a really important event that probably none of us know about, but this was essentially the start of, I would say, really sophisticated, a different level of sophistication in terms of weather predictions, okay, and cyclone predictions. Okay. And the reason is that this satellite, ITOS-1, right, that was launched in orbit in January 1970, was a weather satellite, right? And it was the first of this generation of geosynchronous satellites. So that means that what used to happen is before, when it's not geosynchronous, a satellite's going around Earth and taking snapshots, right? And you'd have to sort of cobble together snapshots to say something about what types of weather systems are forming, right? But this one, because it's geosynchronous, it stays over the North Pole and continuously takes pictures and sends pictures every 30 minutes to what the antecedent of the National Hurricane Center. Okay, so in theory, you can actually now be able to predict cyclones before they occur. So that was extremely important. And the reason that this was a priority for the US government, it was related to some competition with the Soviets. This happened soon after, it's launched soon after the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? There was a Department of Defense priority because, in fact, they say, like this isn't, I mean, even though I'm going to be connecting it to conflict, right? Like this is totally independent. So the idea was that we need to have these satellites to predict weather and predict weather systems and things like cyclones in order to be able to predict brewing conflicts. That's why the Department of Defense was interested. Like they made a connection, sort of a theoretical connection between weather systems and conflicts. Okay, and we get extremely lucky because basically 4 days after the cyclone, November 16th, the tape recorder malfunctions, and basically half of the sensory systems of the satellite just failed. Okay, so we have no more data on the satellite since then. But thankfully, it was timed so that the Bhola cyclone hit just 4 days before this satellite goes out of commission. Okay, so we're able to go back and get those images, right? And so these images are both, of course, visual observations, photos, but also infrared images, okay? And that's going to be important because that allows you to measure radiation, okay? And a paper published in Nature last year, this is, oh, Marty was asking, why are you working on it? But there's a lot of reasons I'm working on it this year, including the fact that this summer I was heavily involved in activism in Bangladesh and got interested in these topics. But the other reason is that a lot of really important things happened in terms of data access and use of the data within the past couple of years, right? So a paper published in, let me show you that paper, right? Nature Atmospheric Sciences, right, in 2023, they basically tell us that you could take those satellite images and create a measure of create a measure of radiation intensity, right? And that will allow you to make an inference about the variation in the storm intensity. And the idea is actually really simple. So basically, the cyclone cloud, the massive cloud cover, prevents solar radiation from hitting Earth, right? And that's what generates the variation in radiation intensity, right? And so that allows us to create this granular measure of storm intensity, right? Of course, weather stations are also available, right? And we have that data too, like wind speed data, but that's not very granular because there's only weather stations in just a few places, right? But if I want to relate it to voting behavior at the sub-district or district level, then I need a granular measure of storm intensity, which is what this gives us, right? And so I end up creating a map like this, which tells me about, like, based on the satellite images, right, how intense was the storm in every district of the country. These are now sub-districts. Back then, I'm sorry. Yeah, these are now districts. Back then, they were sub-districts, right? We had an administrative decentralization in the 1980s. Yeah. So what, for those of you who know Bangladesh, so this would be like, at that time, Upajala. Okay, so I create this measure, and we are also, I mean, we're not only relying on the machine and the indirect inference, right? We can validate the satellite-based measures by correlating that against the ground truth coming from the weather stations, right? Where you have metrics of like wind speed. Okay? And basically, this is showing you that the satellite-based measures, right, correlates quite well with the ground truth, right? But the reason to use the satellite as opposed to the weather stations is because with the weather stations, I couldn't create a disaggregated map like that. Okay. So that's where that's coming from. All right. So now something a little bit about the cyclone.
What is it about the weather station that doesn't allow you to disaggregate?
There's just too few of them. There's just, these are expensive to run, right?
Yeah,
so you just, whereas satellite processing images is now cheap. Yeah, so what I could do is like from the weather stations, right? I could like take those wind speed data, spatially interpolate, right? But then I'd be making additional assumptions, right? And like I'd be linearly interpolating, and who knows how cyclone winds are not linear, right? Yeah. So it's better to use the satellites. All right, so this remains, other than like massive, say, earthquakes or lava events, right? This remains the deadliest event in human history to date, right? So people estimate between 350,000 to 500,000 deaths, and that's really difficult to verify now. I'm sure Marty can tell us a lot about why that would be, like what type of data we had back then. Okay. Now, importantly, many of these deaths occurred after the cyclone had already passed. Of course, there were many deaths due to drowning, right? And like literally being hit by the cyclone, but many was because of lack of distribution of food, medicine, and aid post-cyclone, okay? And here's the amazing statistic, right? Less than $85 million in damages, right? Mostly crowd damages, right? That's not something that should have created 500,000 deaths. Yes.
Would you say that
But
again?
that's
Less
also
than?
because the structures on the.
Yeah, exactly.
not-
Yeah.
They were not Paka structures.
Less than what? What did you say? Could you say that
In
again?
less than $85 million in damages, right? I mean, I'm just trying to give you a sense of like, of course, 300,000 sounds like it's a massive storm. I just also wanted to give you a sense that, there's other metrics that would tell us it wasn't massive. So it wasn't just about the storm, the devastation of the storm itself. It was also about the reaction to it. Okay. Yeah, but Marty's absolutely right that part of the reason why the damages were low is precisely because people did not have structures that were very protective either. Right, one thing is low lying and like huge storm surges, and the other thing is they were made of material that is not giving you much protection. Yeah, I'll show you some pictures like this soon. All right, so then the other part of the story I want to tell you, other than the fact that storm was extremely devastating, both on that day, on those two, like that 24 hours plus weeks after, is that how the government reacted. Okay. And there's a fantastic book where Marty is one of the protagonists. The Vortex, Marty and Candy, I guess.
Yeah.
Your friend. That tells the story that sort of weaves together various narratives. Fantastic book. You guys should all buy it and read it. Yeah. You won't regret it. And here's I want to tell you a little bit about the nature of government reaction and failures here, right? And I'm mentioning the book because some of this information is like secondary information based on what Carney and Milken have put together based on their primary interviews. Okay. So here's the one thing that's a little that was like a total unforced error, right? So because of that exact same satellite I was talking about that was operational, it was possible for us to receive warning about the cyclone and warn people right before it hit, which is the standard practice now, right? So it was anybody like that satellite sending out signals. So anybody with a receiver, and there were many such receivers all over South Asia. So Bangladeshis could have done it. India could have done it, right? I mean, India also suffered a few deaths because of the cyclone's path, right? It was south of West Bengal. And but like nobody like looked. Okay, so that was really unfortunate. Okay. So in fact, the World Bank, again, conflict comes up here. So they were worried about the fundamental instability that might result from this massive cyclone that just hit. Okay, so they had sent meteorologist Neil Frank to Dhaka to investigate the causes of this early warning system failure. Why did it not work? Okay. And here's some other little things about the what happened around that time. So Punjabi officials were charge of running East Pakistan. They were feasting with motor rally drivers 2 days after the cyclone instead of launching relief activities. So that's all the quotations are from that book. Okay. And in contrast, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman actually suspended his election campaign and went with an Awami League boat full of rice sacks and fuel cans, etc., to distribute relief. So he and the Awami League reacted very differently than the incumbent government that was in power. Okay? And the book says, oh, he calculated the trip 10 times more effective for earning votes than doing his standard stump speeches. Okay? That was and then here's a quote from the book. So Candy and Marty, who's sitting right here, so went to meet with senior Pakistan army officials, and hopefully she can tell us more about this story later, right? Who were the gatekeepers to fleets of planes and helicopters that if they had just made that call, they could have saved thousands of lives, right? And the reason is that they had already assembled some relief items that just like the logistical problem of getting the relief material to the south from Dhaka, right? And so they went to meet, I guess must have been at the Intercontinental Hotel. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. There are not that many hotels in Dhaka at that time. The reaction they got was the officials shut the door, put on music, and started dancing.
They wanted to party.
They wanted to party with some, I guess, some very
Dot,
young.
dot.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a slight observation here. I'm really, the government word that you use, I think it should be dictatorship,
Okay, all right.
because there is a very big difference between government and dictatorship.
Okay, yeah.
And this all is happening under a dictatorship.
It's a martial law
Oh.
president. Yeah, it's a
Okay,
martial law
okay.
president, yeah.
Politically,
Right,
you're right.
so-
Legally, it was a government. Politically, you're right. It
So-
was dictatorship.
Wasn't a government. There is a
Okay.
huge difference between
Okay,
dictatorship and.
So here's a positive interpretation of the failure of government response. So Yahya Khan, this book highlights really nicely, was he thought that his path to fame and success was going to be to negotiate a meeting between President Nixon and Chairman Mao Zedong. Okay, so he was very distracted with bigger things, right? And the book talks about like he comes down, does a helicopter flyby and says, oh, it doesn't look too bad. But then after the helicopter, he doesn't even bother to meet with the officials in charge of relief and just flies to Dhaka to attend a party being thrown in his honor by some socialites. Okay. And here's this is from a Pakistani newspaper, right? That's from December 2021, right? Yahya Khan was known, the leader at the time was known to be a party animal.
Another dictator.
Yeah, so, okay, so now, yeah.
On Nixon Mao connection, you can triangulate it with Gary Bass's account.
Yeah.
It's the best we know as of now by political
The
scientists.
blood telegram.
Yeah, you can triangulate it, you can get more right.
Yeah. In fact, I think the Carney, one of their sources was that book.
Quite possible, and maybe Marty also was, it's possible.
Yeah.
Gary Bass.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think Gary did interview us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, so the other source of variation here, so I already told you the main source of variation, which is about storm intensity. The second thing is that, some aid did get distributed over time. So in 1970, we found a report, 1970 report from the World Bank that made lists of where aid was being distributed, right? And they had, that table is a table of those sub-districts I was talking about, okay? And aid, unlike the storm, right? You see that aid was distributed, it was very spatially concentrated in exactly the places where people drowned, okay? All right, so that's going to be my two sources of variation, okay? And so the narrative we're going to evaluate, in my last 5 minutes, I'm just going to give you a flavor of the results, right? And the details of the statistical details, maybe we can discuss later, okay? So the story we're telling is that, look, there was already a pre-existing separatist sentiment. It's not that the cyclone invented the idea of Bangladesh, okay? But the cyclone's devastation did create a focal point for political mobilization. And I think those focal points are important. I was thinking about this because this summer, the quota reform movement, the quotas are totally besides the point, but people needed a focal point to all get in the streets at the same time, right? And this Pakistan government's callous response ignited widespread outrage, and it revealed basically to citizens a leader's type, right? The one thing I remember my father telling me is his statement was, I still remember it when I was a kid, that they just didn't care. Right? It just became really obvious to Bengalis that the government just did not care, right? And there's a really, if I had to add a theory model, I wouldn't write my own, because Besley and Burgess have a really nice paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics on relief distribution in India, where they talk about how opportunistic politicians versus good politicians, right? The opportunistic politicians try to signal that they're good, right? And events like this can, in a signaling model, can help good politicians separate from opportunistic ones, right? And then Awami League contrastic response shifted political views. So that's the first thing we look at statistically, like how did it affect the elections, the vote shares a month later, right? And then the second thing we look at is, okay, a few months later, I already told you the story, that it's essentially a civil war. So these freedom fighters basically start fighting. By the way, a lot of those weapons India was supplying to earlier on, right? And there's also the murder of intellectuals. And so the implications we're going to look at in the data is that did the cyclone affect voting patterns in the December 1970 election, right? And did relief provision mitigate the effects of the cyclone? So if people saw that relief was being provided, their reaction to the government may have been very different than if I was hit by a bad storm and I did not see any relief, right? So we're going to test that as well. And did the experience of the cyclone affect participation in warfare, the guerrilla warfare throughout 1971? And were citizens of devastated areas especially politically active and become Pakistan Army targets? That's what the December data will tell us, okay? So all of this together, it's just telling us, it's not telling us that the cyclone created this entire history, right? But it's telling us the cyclone played some role, right? We're going to be able to sort of isolate that role with the statistical approach we're taking, but we're also be able to quantify like how much of a role it played. Right? Okay, so a quick summary of results. Maybe if I might just do this and not show you tables. Okay. So now imagine, so basically I have, remember the map of cyclone intensity, right? So you could also have a map of vote shares that varies by district, right? So imagine correlating those two things, but also controlling for lots and lots of other things, right? So multivariate regressions where this is a cross-sectional correlation district by district, but we're controlling for a lot, right? We'll go through that later. And we also want to do things like, maybe coastal areas are different, right? There might be some endogenities, right? So then we might want to also run this excluding the coastal areas, right? It turns out the results remain robust, right? Even if you look at all those various perturbations, okay? But essentially in our main specification, what we find is that a 10% increase in experienced storm intensity, okay? That's from the satellite-based measure, right? For every 10% increase in storm intensity, you see an extra 2.5 percentage point increase in the Awami League vote share. And Awami League won big, so so imagine in a place with less storm intensity, they're getting about 74.5 percentage points of percent of the vote, right? So that's just like 10% extra storm intensity is moving that percent to 77. Okay? So that's result number one. And result number two is that we can also look at turnout, right? It turns out that the places that had more intense storm, experienced more intense storm, even though there was massive infrastructure damage, the surprising thing is that, if anything, turnout actually increased a little bit in those areas. People actually participated more.
90% significance.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, weekly, no, sorry, not that. It's just, it depends on what, this is the case where I say weekly because it depends on which specification. Like if I get rid, this is sort of margin, it's like a 1 percentage point increase in vote share. Like if I start putting in lots and lots of control variables, the effect becomes insignificant. Okay. So I'm in the second sub-bullet, right? I'm not as confident. Okay. And then what you do find is that relief efforts mitigated that shift. The increase that I'm talking about in Awami League vote share, that is particularly pronounced in the areas that were hit by the storm but did not see relief. So in fact, in some sense, you are excluding the coastal areas there, right? And you're seeing the worst situation was you get hit by the storm, you don't see any relief. So it wasn't like the places that were most acutely hit by the storm. That's where the vote share goes up a little bit. Okay. And then the bullet, does this work?
It's laser pointer.
Oh yeah, I see it. It doesn't. Okay, there it is. So now I'm talking about this. Okay. So now when I look at, I have this list of freedom fighters, right? An archive list. I digitize it. That includes information on their birthplaces. Okay. So now you could imagine now that same map that I created, right? I could have that map with sort of varying intensity of like where the freedom fighters come from, right? And what you see is the areas, again, same type of regression, the areas that were hit by the storm, right? Those districts are disproportionately represented in that list of birthplaces of freedom fighters. The freedom fighters are more likely to show up from those types of places.
But is that the areas that storm intensity only, and also neglect, or is it storm intensity only?
This one, I think both, right? But the effect I'm talking about there, it's moving from in that list, right? There's an average of like 5 people per district in the list of freedom fighters. Like when you look at 10% increase in storm intensity, instead of 5, it becomes 6.
Yeah.
Okay. And the last thing is that the list of birthplaces of the intellectuals who were murdered on December 14th, 1971, right? They're also disproportionately, the storm hit districts are disproportionately represented in that list as well, right? So this is not me saying, by the way, this is not, the story isn't the Pakistan government looked at a map of where the storm hit and then decided, oh, we need to go after these people. It's just that there are some people who sort of rose up as sort of leaders, right? Movement leaders, right? And the surprising thing is that the people who, when Pakistan government did make that list, the military, sorry, I should say, made that list, okay? They were targeting certain people, right? And the people that they were targeting happened to be a lot of them related to the storm. Okay? And by the way, I mean, just to make sure we understand the quantification here, right? Like we're talking about a move from 74 to 77% of vote shares, right? This is not the full story, right? What I'm able to identify here is not like, oh, the storm created this. Of course, the less hit areas, they also learn, and some of that vote share is also due to people's experience of the storm and the government reaction, but I cannot identify that. All I can identify is the extra storm intensity, right? Did it lead to extra political mobilization, extra voting behavior, extra freedom fighting, extra targeting, etc. Okay? So I think, going to just stop here because we're basically out of time, and I have a lot of slides with the table versions of what I just told you, right? But that's my story.
Thank you. Yeah, so now we'll have Marty give us some perspective from on ground for around 10 minutes. I'll give you a 5-minute warning.
Okay, I'll just stand as well. Because if people follow it.
And we
need
could,
this.
we could switch. Why don't you come here?
Okay, all
And
right.
then I'll-
Marty slides.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay,
Oh, Marty.
It's
Yes. Sure, please. Well, first of all, thanks to the seminar organizers, Ashu and others, for inviting me to speak. And it certainly brings back very vivid memories, and it was interesting to jog those and think back. So I'm gonna, and then I just want to say also thanks to you and your colleague, because this is really important research and very interesting results. And the topic has become more topical
Yeah.
because we're living in an era of, I said, climate shocks and political change, but I think we're living in an era of climate shocks and political shocks and understanding the linkages. And as I said, it's a topic that's seared in my memory, close to my heart, as my husband Lincoln and I and our 10-month-old son Greg were eyewitnesses to this and to the birth of Bangladesh. So 3 parts, hopefully short. One is just my firsthand experience summarized. It's a few comments on the presentation or the slides that I read, and then some closing reflections. So the lived experience, I have 2 slides. My husband Lincoln and I arrived in Dhaka with our infant son in July of 1970, and we came to East Pakistan because I grew up in neighboring India, wanted to go back, and Lincoln was a public health doctor, they all had to do public health service. I heard NIH, the National Institutes of Health, had a sister organization in Dhaka, East Pakistan. I said, let's go there instead of Bethesda, Maryland. So we did. And we were welcomed immediately into a circle of expatriates at the Colorado Research Lab and a wonderful circle of East Pakistani friends. And so between August and September, we learned a lot about the freedom movement led by Sheikh Mujib and the grievances against the central government in West Pakistan, the lack of, well, you saw all the statistics. And then in Dhaka, when it hit, it was just sort of unsettled weather. I don't think news of the cyclone actually reached Dhaka officially until about 2 or 3 days later. But there was a full moon, high tides, all of that contributed to this massive tidal wave. So on November 15th, Candy Rodi, you met her, I mentioned her name, and who was another wife of a Colorado Research Lab doctor, and 2 East Pakistani sisters, we met and said, let's do something, right? And at that time, there wasn't the big NGO scene in Bangladesh. There was the Red Cross and maybe a few others, but not many. So we ended up, we were on the island of Manpura. In one of your slides, the lineup of people for food or relief, that's from Manpura. And it was next to Bhola, and we sent people to Bhola, and a school teacher told us, go to Manpura, it was worse hit. So it should have been the Manpura cyclone. Anyway, and so we started relief, and it included doctors going and food, and we were coordinating supplies, tents from the USA, Ciba-Geigy, crop duster planes dropping supplies, German helicopter crews wanting to know what medicines to take. I mean, it was an amazing time. And then in the middle of all that happens the national election. And of course, Sheikh Mujib won, landslide victory. We're all really happy. And then his opposition candidate, which was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, he proposed to Mujib that they share power, right? And Mujib declined. And so then Bhutto and Yahya delayed the handover of power, like we've heard, and the First National Assembly, and promised March 3rd as when it would happen. And meanwhile, they plotted and planned, and we've heard this firsthand, a military crackdown on East Pakistan. And what they plotted was they would get the soldiers to go to Hindu parts of Dhaka and other cities to whet their appetite for violence, because it would be hard for them to go against Muslim compatriots. But they were also, and this is where they were martyred intellectuals on March 25th, 26th, and political leaders. So, and they plotted this crackdown, and we've heard about it firsthand from Pakistanis, actually. So then on March 1 of, this is now 71, Yahya Khan, sorry, his name is misspelled, proposed, he's the martial law president, postponed the handover again, and the First National Assembly again. It was supposed to be on March 3rd. So on March 7th, Sheikh Mujib gave this very historic, and I should tell you, all this time, all of East Pakistan was alive with this, with all the news that was going on. I can send it to you, yeah. Sheikh Mujib had his historic speech at the Ramna race course, and it called for, we weren't sure whether it was independence or separation, and for resistance. And my husband's brother, who worked for the New Yorker, was visiting, and he went and recorded the speech. And our East Pakistani friends all came to our house to hear what was the word that Sheikh Mujib, what was?
এবারের সংগ্রাম মুক্তির সংগ্রাম,
মুক্তি।
এবারের সংগ্রাম স্বাধীনতার সংগ্রাম. So mukti is
Is
freedom,
freedom.
and shadinata is independence.
Independence, yeah. So they listened carefully to what exactly did he say. So the whole country was alive with this news. And then it was March 25th night, and during the 26th that this military crackdown happened. I'll just give you a little anecdote. We were all alert. We were on the rooftop of our house, just trying to see what was going on in the city. And suddenly there was gunshot very near us. It turned out it was in the electric power station in Gulshan near us. And we went running to get into our house. And then the next morning, a group of us went to another house that had a flat roof, which was near something called, it was the shooting range where people could practice, not just military. And they had lined up men from the neighboring village across the little lake and had them all face down on the ground. And the women were keening in the village. The dogs were howling. I mean, it was just, and I had my Nikon camera, and I was told by the military, don't use that, so I put it down. And they hauled some of the men off. They didn't shoot the ones that remained, but we assumed the ones that were hauled off probably were executed. And then when curfew was lifted on the 27th, we decided to bear witness for the US congressional record, because it was Nixon and Kissinger who had supported the overture to China, and they were so in support of West Pakistan. And so we went around in the few expatriates where we went to different sites where we had heard there was massacre. It's 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, I have to move quickly. Anyway, we went to a Hindu temple, Dhaka University faculty resident, and Shankari Bazaar in the old town, decimated, blood, corpses. And then we were evacuated and took part in an active movement to get recognition of Bangladesh. So there was no doubt, and these are events that we've already heard, that the central government's failure, on top of all the existing resentment, did lead. And Sheikh Mujib went on a 9-day tour in the affected areas. It wasn't just a 1-day, I'm going to give some relief. He went on a 9-day tour. So just a few words on the research. I think it's really important and it's impressive, all the unique sources of data that you've pulled together. But I think we need to understand the causal linkages as a chain of events, not just the cyclone and the lack of response. So the first, I think there really is a direct cause and effect between the lack of appropriate response and the resounding victory for the Awami League. And I was intrigued by your variables where you were able to get the data. The one on the martyred intellectuals and freedom fighters, I find it a little harder to really think it was the devastation of the cyclone, because there were martyred intellectuals in March. And as far as I know, when they plotted in West Pakistan, at that point, they didn't target, but they went like to the faculty residences of Dhaka University. They went to places where intellectuals would be, where Hindus would be. And then in December 14, there was the very targeted, but I think it was less, as I remember, than in March 26. And I was intrigued that the freedom fighters would come a little bit more from that. I'm just intrigued by those. You had another one that, so I think you need in your timeline to keep all these events there, because your timeline's a little truncated. So you can think about that. Sorry, there was one slide there. You had something about jute growing and rice growing areas. I don't really subscribe to that, because I looked up again the cultivation cycle of jute. You argued that jute growing areas had more Awami League turnout, presumably because jute was exported, it brought in income. But the jute of 1970 would have been planted and harvested by mid-year, right?
So it wasn't, it's not so much about that particular amount of jute that period. It's just that in jute growing areas, right, there was a bit more knowledge about the fact that there was this economic inequality, because we're not
the economic inequality. Yeah, because with the rice, the big almond harvest was pretty devastated, and the seeds you needed for the biggest crop, the boro, was also in short supply.
Right.
So I don't know. I had a little
Yeah. Also, the rice growing and the jute growing areas are clearly spatially differentiated.
There's 2 kinds of jute and
Right,
3
so
kinds of rice, so it's not quite so
that
clear.
would be also, that should be important for
Yeah.
you, right?
Yeah. So I mean, there is some differentiation, but not. I wouldn't say it's like, oh,
Very
you should
sharp.
just
Because
Anyway,
one crop could be jute and one crop could be rice, right?
Yeah.
In the same area.
in the same
you
year.
can.
Yeah.
And the same upazilla. So so just an academic reflection. This is just, I'm an anthropologist trained to believe that participant observation is a reliable source of evidence, even at a micro scale. But I've worked on economic issues and recognize that economists and other policymakers rely on large-scale statistical data and statistical methods to have really reliable evidence. So I admire and appreciate all you've done to assemble all of this. And I think the results are very important, but we knew on the ground. Except I didn't know about more martyred intellectuals and more freedom fighters from the coastal badly hit areas. But I think it's really important to make the case, especially now. And just a personal reflection, if I may. You know, this experience changed the direction of our careers, both my husband and myself. I was doing Sanskrit, he was doing biomedical research. We both got into development. And we have a son and daughter-in-law who've lived in Bangladesh, and 3 grandchildren. It really just shaped our life, and we're entirely indebted to Bangladesh. But I also wanted to know, and this is the age thing, that I was also witness to and we did call it the partition, because I was in India, the birth of independent India and Pakistan in 1947. I was 3.5, but I remember the mosque burning in our little town.
Manpuri.
No, I was in Mussoorie.
In Mussoorie.
In Mussoorie, and
Oh,
we
did
could
you go to
look.
Woodstock?
Yeah, yeah.
I went to Kodaikanal.
Oh my God, we're rivals. Oh my God.
As a 3.5.
5 generations have studied.
Okay.
3 generations in my family have taught, and 2 were principals, 2 generations.
At Woodstock.
Mm,
Wow. Okay.
That's right, okay.
That's the second best school in India.
So, you know, at partition, my grandparents who worked in Rawalpindi, and we were up in Mussoorie, my baby brother was born, and I was holding their hands looking out at the burning of the mosque. And then our family was separated because they returned to what had become Pakistan, and we stayed on in India. And for us,
What were your parents doing?
they were missionaries,
Missionary, okay.
grandparents, yeah, Protestant missionaries in education. I hasten to add. And so we were US citizens, so we could come and go across. I drove to Pakistan in January of 1948 with my parents. Yeah, yeah.
Now you gotta go by Dubai.
Yeah, so, and we could come and go, and our son worked in Pakistan, worked in Bangladesh. So we just have a lifelong indebtedness to Bangladesh and South Asia, and I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Lovely. Actually, just on that point, Salman, can you go back to my slides for a second? I want to share something
Okay.
on just something given the personal reflection. This I'll take a second. So of course I have kids now who are growing up here, and so I'm, you know, this is also sort of coincidental for, let me see if I can find the picture. Yeah, I wanted to show a picture of like what the infrastructure looks like, you know, and why is it that the devastation was so bad, conditional on the storm intensity, right? So then I was looking for pictures on my phone, and I found this one. That was the best picture I had. That's my son.
Oh.
So now last summer, I made, you know, he was in Shatkhira in like the coastal area.
Right.
So he's working on like, you know, why is there salinity intrusion, etc. So now he's on an environmental science program. I went to his school to see what he was doing. I was invited for a weekend. He's like, to address climate change, he's inserting like some kind of fungi in spinach to see if he could make it a bit more salt tolerant. Right. So I'm paying a lot of tuition for him to become a farmer. Anyway, we can move on.
Okay, so the transition is going to be really stark because I have no, I'll sit, but I have no lived experience in Bangladesh. And actually, to be honest, reading this, you know, the slides and looking at the tables of the paper encouraged me to read about Bangladesh this week. So I was just like reading a variety of things about the cyclone. So I hope my comments are helpful with you with respect to thinking about, you know, as you're writing the paper, additional data you can collect, additional tests to run. So it will focus a little bit more on that. So apologies for kind of the transition. But I hope our questions kind of focus on both sorts of sets of things. Okay, so you know, brief overview of the paper. You know, it's about the 1970 Bhola Cyclone. You know, it sort of highlights how the government's callous response galvanized support for the independence movement. You know, amazing, rich data sources. I really enjoyed you showing us the details of that satellite. I thought it was kind of fascinating that it captured it before, but right until after the cyclone. Some election, you know, outcomes that are digitized and new. I believe the insurgent participation, intellectuals. This is all, I think, new data. So I think there's a huge kudos for that. And the mechanism highlighted is citizens really learning about the government by observing their response to the cyclone, and then that having this electoral impact and downstream consequences for the independence movement. So I'll give a couple of comments, but just to say, I mean, I think the main effects I found, quite empirically well supported and aligns, as you mentioned, with, sort of the historical record of what happened in the time period. So most of my comments will focus on kind of thinking through the mechanism, which you also highlighted as sort of a key contribution of the paper. I'll talk about a potential additional actor and, it's just some general framing, and I'll try to be brief. So in terms of mechanisms, as I was thinking about the voters' response to seeing, this natural disaster happen, and then the, West Pakistani government not responding effectively, I was trying to think of some heterogeneity that you could test to get a sense that this is actually what's driving the differences. And so the first was thinking about some past cyclones. So I was reading about, I got intrigued by the fact that the cyclone was so massive. So I was like, was this the first one? And it looks like there were some cyclones that happened 10 years prior that were actually quite damaging as well. And the government had the US come in to essentially teach them how to, kind of set up infrastructure to be able to respond to this. And so I wonder if you could sort of identify what areas these were, and those voters would be actually more likely to be, upset at the government, because this is now two occurrences in which a cyclone has happened that the government has been less responsive to. Similarly, there may be a set of voters who actually thought maybe the government was at least moderately responsive. And so there were some, essentially, I thought, it seemed like after the cyclone, there was an effort to push the election, which didn't end up happening. But that's actually because the election had already been pushed from October to December. And so, and this was because of some flooding in August. And so I wonder if the places that were heavily affected by that flooding in August are places where, and then the government decides to move the election, are places that the voters actually view them as kind of responsive in that time period. And so maybe these are places where the citizens might be less likely to see the response to the disaster. I mean, these might be small effects, if any, but I think there could be a way to kind of incorporate some of the other environmental factors happening around the time. The sort of second comment I had was about the role of other political parties, and this is revealing myself as a political scientist and someone who thinks party politics is interesting and electoral politics. But it seemed to be the case that there were other electoral players who sort of sat out of this election, right? And partially because of the response to the cyclone. So, this National Awami Party, which is another sort of active player in East Pakistan at the time, in addition to other parties, sort of boycotted the election. So I wonder if there's a story of elites sort of stepping out of the election, and that's actually what ends up being able to coordinate most of the sort of pro independence vote for the Awami League. And so, it's still a story of voters, but it's also a story of elites, sort of removing themselves. And so you can look at kind of the number of candidates, the number of parties, vote dispersion, these types of measures to get a sense of if there's an elite sort of component to the story. I hesitate to say alternative mechanism. I'd say probably some sort of a complementary mechanism.
Yeah.
So the last, so I have some additional comments which I'm happy to send you. I think I'll just say that I'll just mention kind of the last one, which I think is interesting, is I find that sometimes we do these back of the envelope calculations to figure out the impact. And so I wonder if you could use that to get a sense of if it would cause the Awami League to lose majority and lead to actually potentially the unlikely effect of Bangladesh independence. Perhaps it's not that impactful of a story, but I'd be curious to get a sense of some of the kind of substantive responses in terms of like who controls the National Assembly at the center. And I can talk to you about the other comments separately as well. So I think I quite liked this paper and presentation as even just a study of what's happening in Bangladesh in this time period, especially given what's happened this summer. But as you think about, kind of the framing more broadly, and you sort of point to this in the presentation and the more broader thinking, but there's questions about if this is just about separatist movements or if it's about collective action in general, questions about if it's about environmental disaster versus just any callousness by the government. And I think there's an opportunity to kind of, highlight that as you work on the introduction, the conclusion, and those sorts of parts of the paper. But I really enjoyed this. I learned a lot, both from your presentation, from Marty's comments, and my own delving into some Bangladeshi politics this week. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. And I might just take 2 minutes and just respond to just a couple of things, right? But the first thing I want to say is that, like, I'm just so happy to be here. This feels like the best of social science, like where many different approaches, like, there's lived experience, there's participant direct observation, right? And then there's also, like, I didn't have to be Bangladeshi, even if I never set foot in the country, right? Just based on the satellite data, if I just had those skills, then we actually learned something from it, right? Of course, being Bangladeshi and hearing these stories growing up did tell me what to test, like what to look for. And so this goes to Marty's comments about, I didn't know about the disproportionate representation of those districts among freedom fighters, etc. Yeah, I mean, we didn't either. Like, nobody knew, right? And in fact, like, my first reaction, so first we were like, okay, let's look at freedom fighters, because that is the most obvious next thing to look at after voting behavior, right? So voting behavior makes sense, especially given Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's reaction relative to the Pakistan government's reaction. And then we look at freedom fighters and it shows up there, right? I was like, wow, that's really interesting. We didn't know, but the fact that it shows up statistically, that's where large sample data can help illuminate some things that are not really obvious, even like when you're doing direct conversations with people, right?
Could you repeat that again?
Yeah.
The disproportionate.
So basically, yeah. So
and you say, but you're saying it's not clear that it's intended, huh? It is.
Oh no! In this case, okay. So let me tell that story again.
Yeah.
Okay. So, thanks. So basically, I'm gonna So here's essentially what we're doing. Okay.
Right.
So this is the storm intensity. Okay. And this is votes for the Awami League.
Yeah.
Okay. And you correlate these two maps and you see the
2.5%.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Right. And now I don't know if I have a map of it, but okay, this is the data for the birthplaces of, this is the list of freedom fighters. I just don't know if I have a map of this, but imagine that I have a map, right? Like this, okay? And what's going on is, so I see a map like this where the darker colors are more freedom fighters from those districts, right? And then I take that map, correlate it to this one, right? I see the exact same thing, right? So not only were people showing up to vote more for the Awami League in those districts, right? Some of those people were more likely to also take up arms 3 months later, right? And those exact districts, like, so basically, where is this coming from? These, like, so the districts right around here, right, were hit pretty badly, right, but did not receive aid, right? So those are the places where, like, the vote shares go up the most, and they're also the places where the more freedom fighters show up.
But they're also closest to Dhaka.
Yeah, so we control for that. So basically,
Okay.
so basically, I mean, of course, just in shorthand, I'm telling you, I'm correlating these two maps, but literally it's not just the correlation of those two maps, right? We are also, like, looking at, coastal versus not, Hindu share of the population.
Okay, I was going to say that, because up in the northeast, there was a lot of Hindus. Right?
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So
and they just fled because.
You might also think those are the areas, those are the areas where you'd see.
No, northeast.
Here,
Yeah,
northeast,
there's
okay.
a lot.
And then there's a lot over here as well. I mean, those are the areas that independent reasons would be voting for Awami League as well.
Fled.
Right.
Right.
And but they fled like a few months later. So this is still December. I mean, the voting was done in December.
No, I don't question the vote at all. It's the other that puzzles me.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that, like, we're controlling for a lot of these other factors. Like, that's a cross-sectional controls, right? And then there's a bunch of placebo tests that we do as well. So for example, you can look at, this radiation measure, right? Let's take like the day before the storm hits, okay? Variation radiation. Turns out it doesn't predict any of these things. Okay. It was really about, like, the cyclone variation, as opposed to some characteristic of those areas, which might be whether it's more Hindu populated or not, which could also have happened, right? So we control for all of these things, right? So it's okay. So that's this, and here's the part that I found most surprising. Okay, so then I'm like, okay, here's the, like, is it the case that the Pakistani government started paying more attention to these areas because these places were more politically active, right? So that's where, of course, you know, this is something for me and my family, that event is very important of the December 14th, right?
He was not born.
I was not born.
No, but where were they? Where were they?
Oh yeah, my parents actually came back from West Pakistan. So what happened is, so they were in West Pakistan and they rushed back, right?
Uh-huh.
And so while, you know, they were supposed to be in Dhaka, but then my dad's family, we're from here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
So then he was like running around trying to find his brothers and sisters and his parents to try and, you know, and that the story is about my mother spent a night in like a is that in Bangladesh?
Cowshed.
Yeah, cowshed. Thank you.
Gaushala.
Yeah. So So my family was around. Thankfully, my mom was pregnant with my older brother at the time. And so okay, and here's the even more surprising thing. So then we look at, so it's not that those intellectuals were murdered in those districts, right? They were mostly murdered in Dhaka and Chittagong,
Yeah.
right? But we can look at their birthplaces now, right? And then it turns out those birthplaces, like in these types of districts where the storm hit badly, right?
Mhm.
The birthplaces of the intellectuals are more likely to be in these types of districts. It is stunning, right? I mean, and this is not something like I you know, like we had our error on the regression. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, you know.
But there's still a correlation here. Right?
Yeah.
We don't know the causation is not.
Yeah, the causation. Okay, so here's my preferred story for the causation. Okay,
Yeah.
so basically imagine, okay, the storm hits these areas, okay, and then people, and then especially like take away just this part of it where they saw some relief. There's all these other areas that gets hit pretty badly with the storm. They don't see any relief. Okay, and people get really pissed off. Okay, they understand, you know, they learn something about their government. They get really pissed off, and that leads to changes in voting behavior. Then it leads to them having being more motivated to take up arms, right? And so there's heightened political activity and activism happening in such areas, right? Both voting as well as, I mean, that's the signals are voting, the signals are taking up arms, right? And so there's that, you know, so over the course of the next 9 months, as our war is raging, right? So there are certain types of individuals that sort of get elevated as, okay, here are leaders of this movement, okay? And just so happens that when you're trying to then identify, okay, who are the leaders we need to go after and hunt down, right? They happen to be born in those types of districts. Not necessarily the case that they were living in those districts. In fact, they weren't. They were mostly, because they're intellectual, they're mostly
Mostly in
Dhaka.
Dhaka.
Yeah, but they, you know, the story would be that unless this is a complete spurious correlation, right? The story would be that those are the people, like, given that their families, right, their connections were particular districts that had clearer signals about what the Pakistan government just did, right? That they sort of rose to the top as the people to be targeted.
But I think,
So that's what,
I think they may have had clearer signals also. I mean, there was so much going around. I mean,
Yeah.
the whole country was on high alert, this whole
yeah,
9 months or whatever it was. And so the news around Dhaka, I mean, the news didn't travel the way it travels now.
no, of course,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then how do you control for all the young men and men who would have died during the cyclone, right? In the districts that are closer
Yeah,
to the
I mean,
cyclone.
we are looking at, so, I mean, if men disappear in
Yeah.
the cyclone hit areas, right?
Yeah.
Then that would actually push the statistics to find the exact opposite, which is those are the places where you don't have as many young men, so you won't have as many freedom fighters. And despite that, like that may have been a factor, and despite that, we're still seeing the exact
But
opposite correlation.
but it's districts that were not close to the
Okay,
coast.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so they
so this is
wouldn't have
where-
had as many
Yeah, so if,
deaths, because we were in Dhaka, not so far from where you're, you know,
Yeah.
and it was severe
Okay.
storm, but I don't think it was,
okay,
yeah. It
So-
was the edge of the severity rather than the core,
Or-
you know, the core area was
Yeah.
the coast and the islands.
yeah.
So
But you're
let's-
seeing, I mean, there is a more pronounced effect in the areas that got hit but did not receive relief. But it's also the case that in the districts where a lot of people died, right here, the per capita participation in warfare is also higher here than elsewhere in the country. That's
Even
it's
before the
just surprising.
cyclone, you can establish the.
Oh, no, not before the cyclone, there's no, like, that's the placebo. The placebo is like,
I see.
yeah, before the cyclone, there's nothing, right? That we can do that, we can run that placebo to see, okay, but why is that placebo helpful? Because it could be that, I mean, there are some reasons Marty is saying, but there could be other reasons that we haven't thought of, right? As to why these particular districts were just like fundamentally different. Maybe people were just more politically active there always, right? But we look a week, no, imagine you look at sort of before, yeah, nothing's going on before.
So let's open up to just broader comments,
No.
just to make sure everyone.
Sure.
So how about we start with you, Ashu, and then we'll go here, and then.
So first of all, thank you for this very impressive paper. I have read a lot about this period as a South Asia scholar, though I'm not a specialist in Bangladesh, but I've read a lot about this. And climate was not a factor in the previous literature. So thank you for bringing something entirely novel to our understanding. Huh? The idea that in the biggest hit constituencies, electoralistics, that is to say, with Awami vote was higher by 2.5% over 10 is not a big deal. 2.5% over 75 is a very big deal. Right? How much higher could it have gone? So that's a very big deal. Going from 10 to 12.5% is hardly. So it's not. Yeah, so that's very important. I have two comments. One is this. I mean, it was quite moving to see you moved by the atrocities and tragedy that you were describing. That was very, very moving to see you pausing for a minute or so. But along the same lines, it seems to me, if we read that literature, older literature, there are three possible targets for the army, Pakistani army. One would be who is part of Mukti Bahini. Second would be who are the leading intellectuals to come public figures. Some may be involved in Awami League, some may be just Marxists, right? Hanging around University of Dhaka. Third, Hindus. And so Jamaat-e-Islami has to be brought into this picture in your narrative somehow, because I have read so much about it. Now, the reason this is also very important is, and I'll send you some quotes from Ayub's two books, right? I wrote a column recently on that, and two paragraphs were based on the biography that was actually released after his death by his son. But in the earlier book is Friends Not Masters, which has only two or three paragraphs on Bangladesh, but very racially charged. So this idea of Hindus is connected to my second point. Hindus, but not only Hindus. Why would help not arrive? Why would government not help a particular set of citizenry in times of unbelievable disaster, natural disaster, right? So I'm saying that there are three of these, but one argument, if you read Ayub, is that Bengalis didn't matter. And there's a lot of literature available on whose misery matters when governments try to intervene. There is a lot, for example, from the American South during Jim Crow that you refer to, right? There is also during the Great Leap Forward in China, whose misery mattered and whose misery didn't matter at all, right? This is not when governments intervene to save a certain part of citizenry from their miserable disaster, then it's not a bureaucratic Weberian bureaucracy function.
Mhm.
There are political motivations, and what is you repeatedly saying? Bengali Muslims are too Hinduized. Repeatedly saying that.
Mhm.
This is not just once, and Friends Not Masters has had the reference once, but the autobiography released after his death has plentiful references that that they need to be reformed by West Pakistani rule and need to be taken away from their Hinduism.
Mm.
This is too Hinduized Islam. It is not worth calling them Muslim.
You know, the irony
Right.
is that this is happening now again. Like now, meaning the last 20 years.
Right. So I believe your story about Nixon Mao. I think it's incidental in my view.
Yeah.
No, but Yahya, the reason.
Yahya was involved, but Yahya doesn't have to be there. There is a bureaucracy
Yeah.
No,
which
but
can
Yahya
respond to the Yahya was involved.
No,
I
no, it
think.
just so happened what Marty's
He
saying is
went
that
to China.
that
when-
particular day
He
he
was,
went to China.
no, not that day. He went to China right after the cyclone hit.
Yeah.
Because he had a planned trip.
Yeah.
On his way back,
He's
he
stuck in
stops in Dhaka for a day.
Yeah.
He goes up in a helicopter and says it doesn't
Yeah,
look
yeah,
so
but like,
bad.
that's
It
not-
looks
yeah.
like-
Disaster relief
Yeah.
does not depend on the head of a government paying attention. I think this is the point I'm making.
Absolutely. Yeah.
If you had a Weberian bureaucracy, it would just go.
Yeah.
Regardless of where Yahya Khan is. He's in Beijing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's trying to help Kissinger. It's a well-known story. Gary Bass will give you the most detailed account we have of this, right?
Yeah.
So I think the notion of who's being targeted, or who's being neglected, or who's being helped,
Yeah.
I think we need to bring in. I think the second book in particular of Ayub plays a very big role, and Yahya Khan we will have to establish is no different from Ayub. Ayub is gone.
Yeah.
Yahya Khan is no different from Ayub. That may be a slightly harder task, but it's not an impossible task. Because this is Ayub Khan is also telling you that Pakistani military doesn't think Bengali Muslims are Muslims.
Crap, now I have to read.
Right?
Ayub
Pakistani
Khan.
military doesn't think so. Huh? Okay. Now
No,
this
no.
but since you're writing about misery
Yeah,
and
yeah,
etc.,
absolutely.
I think this cannot be avoided.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This cannot be avoided because this is in any political explanation that I have read, this would play a big role.
Yeah.
And you are getting, as an economist, you're
Yeah.
applying all that you know, all the techniques that you know to a very political matter.
Absolutely.
So politics will have to be brought in.
So here's
And the party, I mean, I say party politics also, Jamaat is playing some role.
exactly. So
Right.
here's
And
how
there was
I'm
the
already
Bihar-
thinking.
There was the Bihari crisis.
That's-
There was a.
Right.
So
So anyway,
Hey,
that's
here's
connected.
how good. Here's how I'm already thinking about doing it. So of course we now know with more modern data areas where Jamaat is more popular,
Mhm.
right? Because we've seen election results like 92, 96, etc. Right? So we have a sense of that.
Mhm.
So I'm going to add that as like sort of a mediating variable to see if
It works statistically.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can do that. Good idea. Thank you.
I had you next.
Yeah. It happens to be like, hi, I'm from Bangladesh, born and brought up in Bangladesh. I have just a little bit understanding of the education scenario there.
Okay.
Before 1990s, before the Jamuna Setu was built, the northern part of the country was really backward and the education literacy rate was really, really low. And that resembles quite a lot with voter turnouts. And even you go to the Awami,
That's where I'm from.
yeah, I know you're from that same zone probably. Yeah,
Dinaj-
so
No.
what kind of controls did you use for like education? For example, scholars in Bangladesh, they argue that, okay, the educated middle class actually are
Yeah.
attracted by Awami League 6-point movement and all this. So how?
Oh yeah, so back then, there's a lot of variation in even literacy rates,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah,
which is a
yeah.
neat data source to get. Yeah, good. That's a good point. So everything I'm talking about is controlling for like trying to hold education on literacy concept.
Yeah, and as the within country migration was highest from these southern districts that are affected and
Oh,
happened to.
You mean internal migration?
Yeah, within the country.
Yeah.
Yeah, from those
So
southern
to
districts.
certain districts to Dhaka.
Yeah, because
I see.
people
Because
from
the
north and
infrastructure
northeast,
is much
they
better.
don't- Yeah, And another
But they had
question
the
was like,
education too.
So we'll just do one question because there's many people on the list.
please,
Um,
a very short
and-
question, one,
Okay,
30
Okay, sure,
seconds.
sure.
Which freedom fighters list are you using here? From 2021?
Oh, yeah, all right, I'll pull it up and while we take other questions.
Okay, so we're gonna do I'm gonna take two questions and then we'll do responses. So we have one person
Cool.
here.
I'll condense these. So I'm Danielle, I'm getting my history PhD at Tufts. So just couple of comments and questions. The long trope of dehumanization of Bengalis is not just on, you saw me nodding vigorously because I agree, but I want to expand. It's not just off race and religion, but gender as well. This goes back to the colonial period of like the effeminate Bengali and the British sort of like castigation of it versus the masculine Punjabi. There's a very long
Yes.
genealogy of this.
Yeah. And by the way, I also should say it's not just targeted to Bengalis. That is, it's all non-Punjabis.
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like even within
Within West Pakistan, as
Pakistan,
we know,
exactly,
yes,
yeah.
yes, I agree on this.
Yeah.
The other point is that, someone who's studying the archives of 1971, they're so difficult to access. If I spent, the first half of this year in Lahore and Islamabad looking at this, and it's, it's so hidden and locked off and walled off. So I really appreciate this because you're able to triangulate and cross borders in so many different ways. I guess my question is sort of relating to the last one, which is your archival process as a historian. I'm kind of keen to see this. I think you had some backslides alluding to this. I guess the other part, this second part might be sort of out of the scope because it's so large, but we know that 1971 leads to so many refugee flows and migrations, and I'm wondering if you can draw a correlation between the areas that were hardest hit and the ones that saw the most refugee outflows into India or elsewhere.
Yeah, okay.
I wonder, I imagine that's a much larger.
That's a nice, that's a nice
But
thing
I
to
wonder
pursue.
if that's
Okay. I will, that's a great idea. So
Yeah.
I'll pursue it as much as I can and see what.
Thank you very much for such an engaging presentation.
I'm Sharad, I'm MCMP student from Kennedy School. I want to know that you use the election data in the 1970, but there were two elections. There was a National Assembly and another was Provincial Assembly. Which data you have used? One thing, and my second comment is, we have read it in my textbook also in my childhood. But a recent time, a book published by the 14th Division GOC, Major General Khadim Hossain Raja, he wrote a book, a biography, A Stranger in My Own Country. And he mentioned he had, after the cyclone, he was GOC in Dhaka Division. He visited to Bhola, even in Manpura, and he proposed to his Pakistan governor, Vice Admiral Hassan, the Pakistan army want to join the relief, but he blamed them. This Pakistan governor didn't allow it. So with another version from the Pakistan army.
I see.
That is my comment, and I want to know that.
Oh yeah, so this is the National Assembly. The data I showed you, the map I showed you was the National Assembly election. But in 1954, there was an election with we had the United Front that was using the provincial assembly elections. Also, one of the other results that I didn't have time to go over is that from the 1954 elections, we can get a sense of like pre-cyclone, 16 years pre-cyclone, right? What are the areas that have pre-existing sort of separatist sentiments already, right? Where the Awami League was one of the members of this United Front, right? And so what you observe is that the effects are magnified in the areas where UF had already won lots of vote shares, right? So this was like the cyclone was just like magnifying some pre-existing sentiments as opposed to the cyclone inventing a new.
I think that's important.
Very important.
Very important.
Very important.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, I'll bring it forward then.
Yeah.
After National Assembly, after 10 days, there was a provincial assembly election, 17 December 1970.
Yeah, this is I'm using the
Was that fundamentally different? No, it couldn't have been.
One
right?
for the National Assembly,
Yeah.
and another from the provincial assembly.
No, I mean.
Yeah, but no,
What the results, I think Awami must have swept the provincial.
Yeah.
Awami won 288 out of 300 in provincial assembly,
Yeah.
and out of 300 in National Assembly, Awami won 162.
Yeah, so we can certainly do a robustness check to see it, but
Okay, so I have 1, 2, 3, and sorry, I don't know names, so please introduce yourself. You start in the middle, then one.
Okay. My name is Sarah. I'm a Fulbright fellow from Pakistan. First, that I already said that I have a lot of, as a historian, I have a lot of reservations when terms are not used properly.
Okay.
And I think I would be glad if you use dictatorship rather than government, because dictators can have views like Ayub Khan had about Bengalis being lesser beings, but maybe that would not be the view of the whole of East or West Pakistan for that matter. One of the questions was that the uprise, I can see that a lot of things were going on maybe before 1952 as well, like the language movement you said and all that. And being a Pakistani, we have had read literature as we were growing up. Do you think Mujibur Rahman and the recent comment that he made that the governor not allowing the army, West Pakistani army, to help, and I think at that time period we wouldn't call it just the West Pakistani army, it would be an amalgamation of both East and West Pakistan army. So not helping, and then Mujibur Rahman touring the area for a good 9 days. You think that was more of a political movement? I think I would be interested to know that as an historian, that we have to look along these lines. And then we also have to see the recent Bangladeshi movement and the recent regime change and the martial laws in Pakistan as well. Whatever they did to the intellectuals, I am deeply moved. That is exactly what is going on, like in Pakistan since the past 2 years. And then you also have to see that Mujibur Rahman was killed by the Bangladeshi army just 4 years after he took over, and he was declared the father of the nation. So I would like your comments on that.
Sure. So
In the army, the East Pakistan Bengal, there were very few Bengalis.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Very,
yeah. I mean, they
minuscule, right?
exactly, but they did join the freedom fighter movement, the Mukti Bahini movement.
Right.
Yeah, but like it was really not a army such, right, or a paramilitary either. And in terms of like, you know, some of the questions you're asking about, right, such as like the comment that came about the governor of East Pakistan, right? So here I you know, of course, my data doesn't have much to add above and beyond what we already know from a lot of historical accounts, right? And in fact, we have somebody here who lived through that history. So she approached the army, right? And so she can directly tell us what the army's response was, regardless of whatever the East Bengal governor was doing, right? So I don't have much to add to that because those
I
are.
can give you some dates because they also arrived on Manpura without any relief supplies, but tents.
Okay.
And then they didn't want the relief effort to go on. I can give you exact
Exact
dates
dates,
in
okay.
November.
Okay.
I
So
can
yeah,
give
maybe
you-
I just need to take you out for dinner.
Connected to whose misery matters. Right?
Yeah, whose misery matters. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, just a quick comment about you know, you mentioned about like to Hinduize, right? Right. So this is the discussions we have in our country about whether we can call it Ramzan or Ramadan, right? Whether I'm allowed to say Khoda Hafiz or do I have to say Allah Hafiz? These things are happening still. Like, you know, ironically, you know, Ayub Khan's long gone, Yahya Khan's long gone, right? But we're still fighting those battles, right? And in fact, over time, we're losing those battles.
Because you have an underbelly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also a lot of Saudi money, right?
Yeah,
For a particular
certainly.
version of
It's
Islam.
bubbling up now.
Yeah.
So we have one comment here and then.
Hi, I actually have just a general question. My name is Rifat. Thank you for such a fascinating presentation. I'm an MBA students in business school at HBS, so very different world. So my question
I teach in an MBA program.
that's right.
Same world.
I hear State and Society, very popular class at SM. I hear. My question is like, what can those of us who are not in the field, who are not researchers, who are not political scientists, and this, you know, so much of this is like forgotten or willfully forgotten. What can we do to raise awareness of these issues or the history and educate others, you know, as future leaders?
Sure. Okay, no, that's a great question. So let me actually, I'm gonna answer it in sort of sideways, okay? So just yesterday, a student came to my office who's Pakistani, actually a Pakistani Hindu student. Right? Yeah, right. Apparently like one of the 2% of the population, right? Her name is Simran, and I apparently should have understood from the name Simran that she is Hindu, but like, I couldn't. So then, you know, so recently for the MBA students at Yale, sometimes in every 2 years, as the students cycle, they ask me to do something called just like go and talk to them about my life, right? Like called Faculty Voices. So after I did that, so I've had steady stream of students coming through and saying, what can we do? How do we, you know, because I also talk about how I'm trying to get my kids to do things that matter for people, you know? And so what Simran's doing, who's an MBA student, so she's going to move to Bangladesh, to this coastal area this December, right? Along with a few other students, because we're trying to set up sort of a new entrepreneurial ventures in order to provide safe drinking water. And actually the person sitting right opposite you, Dave, knows a lot about this in that region. So the idea is that like, there's now, because of salinity intrusion, people don't have drinking water, right? And we need to set up a business model to make it financially sustainable. The MBA students are going and helping us do that, right? How do we find entrepreneurs? How do we, BRAC is financing them like up to $10,000 loans, which is great. But we need also to understand like the technological setup of like how do we make these things run. So I think rather than thinking about like educating others, like think about what your skill set is, what your comparative advantage is, and how do you make use of it to help people. And it doesn't have to be in Bangladesh if you happen to have a Bangladesh connection, right? Like it can be in Sierra Leone, it can be in Jamaica or Honduras. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Ian Talbot. I'm a historian and I've been fascinated by this study. I think it's great. I just wanted to throw in a few sort of general comments, picking up really on what's being discussed, in terms of whose misery, how we can sort of break this down a bit from government. I mean, this is a Punjabi dominated bureaucracy. This is a Punjabi dominated army that's operating in East Pakistan. That's part of the resentment. It's not just economic issues, but that's part of the resentment. Also, some of those people within those positions did carry an inherent racist attitude towards Bengalis, which was another feature that we've been mentioning in the discussion. And I just wondered whether it's a possible variant in terms of voting patterns, in terms of, are there different voting patterns in areas where there are Bengali district officers and Punjabi district officers? Are Punjabi district officers less likely
in the civil bureau?
Yes, are less likely to be bothered because of these inherent attitudes. I just wondered whether that could be something that might be developed.
Nice idea. Okay, so we'll look for the data. So these are all, I love these comments because, of course, the theory is, I mean, like where your question's coming from, that's very solid. I understand the logic, right? Now, whether I can make it testable depends on data and a lot of sort of archival work, and we'll see whether we can do it. Right? That's a great idea. Thank you. And that's also true of many of the ideas you shared.
This should be available action. Whether
Yeah,
districts were Punjabi,
the
district officers,
but the officers,
Punjabi or Bengali.
Okay.
Just in terms of districts, Chakma area, that was one of the seats that didn't go to Awami League, right? That was from the royal family at the Chakmas. The other is, I wonder about Comilla, because Comilla was, that sort of academy and all the development work that went there, right?
And Matlab,
Matlab and the Comilla Academy.
Okay. One question.
Yes. Hi, I'm Mira, also from the business school here. One of the things about the research is that it tests, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it tests how the storm intensity affects vote share for the Awami League, right? That's the kind of postulated. And the idea is that, like, if you were impacted more by the cyclone, you are more likely to vote for the opposition. I'm wondering, like, how do we test for the impact of the cyclone itself, right? Because, like, you're testing for the impact of variation in the cyclone, but not for, like, the actual occurrence of the cyclone. And, like, is it possible to use vote share in previous elections and then, like, correlate the intensity of the storm in various regions against the vote share between elections to test for, like, the change in vote share instead? Right. Or is that just like?
But there's only one election before that, right? 54.
Yeah, but the bigger
there's a
there was a lot of
54 and 17.
Pakistan did not allow.
Pakistan didn't allow
but, but the thing is that actually the first part of your question explained why there's a bigger limiting factor, right? But you've picked up, but it's good that you've picked it up exactly right. Exactly what the variation is. And it's great to see HBS students here. I wish my MBA students showed up more to seminars too. So the issue is that, because it's just like a singular event that happened on that day. So, unless I use variation across districts, right?
Yeah.
I'm just talking about before versus after.
Yeah.
Right. And there's not enough variation for me to say something. So essentially, another way, I'm glad you raised the question because, like, when I show that, because of extra storm intensity, the vote share increased from 75 to 78, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the fact that it was at 75 right, that also reflects a lot of reactions to the
Right.
storm.
Right.
Right, because like the whole country knew what Pakistan just did. And of course, it might have, like the baseline might have been 60 rather than 75 if
Yeah,
that event hadn't
exactly.
happened. But there's no way for me to use this type of variation to be able to pick out how much of that effect, how much of the main, let's call it the main effect of the storm versus the marginal effect of
Yeah.
extra storm. Actually,
Yeah.
the way to think about this entire study is the marginal effect of excess storm intensity, right? So when I say that, oh, like 3 percentage points is due to the storm, right? Like you should think of that as an underestimate of
Yeah,
how
yeah.
important the storm was.
So you're saying it's not like there just isn't data on previous elections to measure like change in vote share?
Yeah, even if there was, I mean, there isn't that, but even if there was, I still have the problem that like I don't observe a world without the storm.
What do you mean?
Like, so for me to understand, like whether the storm, how much of the effect the
You can
storm
also look
had.
at that. You could still look at
Yeah,
storm intensity across regions.
yeah, it's just pre-post, right? So
Yeah.
basically, I look at, so basically, then even if I had, let's say, another election in 1966, right? I just have Bangladesh in 1966 against Bangladesh in 1970, and I'll have to make the claim here that, oh, Bangladesh in 1970 behaved differently than 66 because of the storm, and you'd be saying to me, no, there's a lot of other things that change.
Yeah.
That's what
It's still
yeah.
variation in storm intensity, right?
Oh yeah, but then I would only get that region extra storm intensity effect, not the main effect.
One question here. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Mohammed. I'm Mushfiq's older research assistant, so I'm a little bit jealous that I didn't get to work on this. Worked on something else. But so my question is basically this. So how much of the increase in vote share is driven by the visits of Awami League? Like, is there so the story you're basically telling is that the government had the capability to help, right? But the selectively did not choose to help, and then people had these resentments and something. The thing that I'm thinking about is generally the government did not have any capacity to help at all. But the Awami League used
In order to, that's related to the I guess Sarah's question.
And that's something that you see like in other situations as well. For instance, Pakistan, there is a flood takes place. The government does not provide relief. Local religious elites or like Taliban staff come in and provide relief. And then you see that there is an increase in support for that. So how much of that increase in 2.5 is driven by the Awami League's activism versus the state's interest?
Right.
Yeah.
Great. So when I think the testable thing I'm trying to convert is that what we need data is on like Sheikh Muji's visit schedule, exactly where he went,
Yeah.
etc.
The other thing is,
And so for example, when I say that I didn't show you the tables, but there's different effects in areas that were hit by the storm and got relief versus areas that were hit by the storm and did not get relief, but did not get relief. Those are the biggest moments, right? That could be picking up that the areas that got actually it would go in the opposite direction. I was going to say that, so just like I have that variation, if I have a third variable I can create, which is where did the Sheikh Mujibur Rahman go with his boat, right? I can look at that. I'll look for it.
and this relief targeting, I think it's like, I'm not exactly sure yet, is like what drives that relief targeting? Is like, how is government thinking where to provide relief? Is like, were they giving relief to people where there was less resistance?
Yeah, so if you look at the map of where the relief targeting was, it was, no, it wasn't about less resistance. It was just like the eye of the storm. The eye of the storm passed over certain areas. That's where they were. So basically where there was, things were bad for multiple reasons. So one is that there's a lot, there's a whole bunch of, like dead bodies floating, right? And then there's also other types of misery, which is not just like just a stench of death around me. There's also, like people are desperate for food rations, right? So it seems like, I mean, if you look at the map of where there was more relief targeting, is where there was most obvious stench of that.
Because there was tidal wave impact and there was wind impact, right?
Yeah.
And that
Exactly.
difference, yeah.
So the only thing is that, of course, the stench of death that I'm talking about, sorry to use this kind of language, but a lot of dead bodies were also floating down rivers.
So we're at about time. I know other
That was
people
a,
have
that was a
questions,
great place
but,
to end. though.
but yeah, I know we.
Objection.
I know other folks have questions, but thankfully we have some time outside with samosa and wine and maybe chai. So I hope you all will join me in thanking Mushfiq for coming, Martha for joining us.
Originally, as Ashu knows, I was just going to talk about my last 20 years of work on seasonal poverty in North Bengal, right? But I'm glad we did this because what you guys just put together is just amazing. Having historians, having anthropologists, having this conversation between political science, economics, and quantitative as well as qualitative. It's really just fantastic. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks so much.